It is funny how big life decisions sometimes hit you early on, and the implications of which don't play out for decades down the road. And so
Hi, this is Abhilash Jayakumar, co-founder and managing director of Trust Vista. Thank you for joining us on today's Trust Vista Talk. My guest today is Stephen Toy. Stephen Toy is the managing partner and co-founder at BroadPeak Global, an independent specialist private equity firm dedicated to opportunistic buyouts and special situation transactions in the global industrials, materials, and chemicals sectors. Before starting his own firm in September 2020, Mr. Toy worked as a senior managing partner at Invesco Private Capital and WL Ross & Co. He was also the Senior Vice President of M&A and Corporate Restructuring Group at Rothschild. Stephen graduated summa cum laude with a BS in Business Administration from the State University of New York at Albany. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Abby, it's a pleasure seeing you. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on launching BroadPeak as an independent platform, but you've been building businesses for a long time. Can you maybe start at the beginning and talk to us about how you got into the world of private equity?
Sure. It's a great question. My background's a little bit different than many who came into the business, and I think is an example of sometimes you just don't see exactly what's further down the road. And so, as you mentioned, I actually had started off my career out of undergraduate school in public finance, so the issuance of municipal bonds for various public works in U.S. Municipalities. It's what I had focused on in my undergraduate studies, and had been convinced that that's where I wanted to build my career. And unfortunately, I got about a year into it, and decided that I didn't see myself necessarily doing it long term, which was a bit of a surprise at the time. And so
I had the meaning of life when you were 19.
Yeah, I was almost 21, so I was far more mature than 19. but yeah, it is funny how big life decisions sometimes hit you early on, and the implications of which don't play out for decades down the road. And so I made the decision to go back to business school and sort it out, and coincidentally had accepted to attend University of Michigan in sort of in the fall of 1996. And my managing director at the time, who happened to write my recommendation as well, had introduced me to Wilbur Ross at the time, who was running the corporate finance department at Rothschild, and said that they were looking for third-year analysts, and I should go talk to them. And in my own mind, I thought, right, we both know what I'm doing next year. I'm not sure why this is something that that makes sense. And he just encouraged that, look, you really should take the meeting, understand sort of what's out there and what your options are. And that really was very fortuitous advice. And so I did. And at the time was offered, why don't you take a third year analyst position here? It's a completely different sector. So at the time, focusing on M&A and corporate restructuring, and the rationale being that it would give me a bit more of a diverse perspective going into my MBA program. And so thinking it through, it made a lot of sense. I agreed to sign on for a year. And contrary to my initial experience in public finance, just really resonated to me in terms of the work we were doing. And so what I had done was defer my program for a year. And 12 months came by pretty quickly. Phoned up the university and said, hey, they want me to stay on a bit longer. How much can I defer again? They said, no, you either come come to classes this fall, or you have to start the process all over again. And so I've yet to refill out my application, so to speak, and it's been a quarter of a century later. And so it was sort of a lucky turn, I suppose, early on in my career, but I found a spot that just really had passion for, and one that I want to spend more time around.
Yeah, I have a saying I like. It says, Never let schooling get in the way of your education, right?
That's right. That's right. That's a good one. That's the first time I heard it. And so, going into that field, so transitioning into corporate finance, and this was way back in 1996. Coincidentally, within this was at Rothschild at the time, very early on in my time there. And one of the reasons I wanted to stay longer, we were just starting to gestate the idea of going into investing as well as just doing the advisory part of the business. And so in the middle part of 1997, we decided to launch our first private equity fund. At the time called the Rothschild Recovery Fund One, and so modestly sized fund. It was 200 million. We raised it pretty quickly, and lo and behold, sort of right after we had closed it, the initial Asia economic crisis hit, and so we ourselves did not have a presence in Asia. But we understood that that's where the opportunities were going to be, and so being young in my career, being still one that was very ambitious and wanting to do more, see more, accomplish more, I packed up a suitcase, put my hand up, and said, I'm happy to drop ship into where these opportunities are and figure out how we should be positioning capital. And so in 1998. I decided to well, I was still based out of New York the entire time, but spent probably 330 days a year in Asia. And so initially I spent nearly 2 years on the ground.
So you're really based out of Cathay Pacific then?
Yeah, no, exactly. So airplanes, hotels, ultimately took up an apartment. So really based out of New York from just a taxpayer perspective, but doing much of my work overseas, and so and it was really fascinating because at the time, the whole region had gone into crisis. My first stop was in Korea and Seoul, South Korea, and it was really the first time in many decades that they had seen financial distress and were not necessarily well versed in how to deal with it. And so, bringing turnaround expertise, restructuring expertise and new capital into the situation and drop shipping into the geography, we were able to find a number of just very attractive opportunities. It's sort of the cliche saying of finding the good businesses with bad balance sheets, and that's exactly what was happening there. And so we were able to identify a number of opportunities to invest in and shepherd through what was a very new activity for the country. After that, I spent another just about a year in Osaka, Japan, where we had taken over a regional bank from the government. It was a failed regional bank that ended up being nationalized in essence by the Japanese government, and so we pulled that out and made it a very stable and profitable institution after we injected new capital into it. And so I spent a number of years in Asia, and just as those activities were starting to wind back down and I was repatriating myself back to the US, Wilbur Ross, who had run the department and run our investment activities, decided that what we were doing around investing was interesting enough, exciting enough, big enough to really form a new enterprise around. And so we, Wilbur, myself, a handful of other people, decided to spin out of Rothschild, and we created W.L. Ross & Co. And so this was in the spring of 2000. And so sort of my first experience in terms of setting off with just a blank slate and looking to build a new business. And so, with that, we continued to raise new capital, invest in new situations, find new opportunities that we thought were interesting ways to generate returns. And so we remained independent from 2000 to 2006, and we ultimately were acquired by Invesco, the large asset management platform, in 2006.
You know, you talked about how you got into this industry kind of by happenstance, not by a discrete plan. If you kind of look at the career path for a lot of people in this industry now, it's kind of a path that's pretty well defined. You get an internship at a large bank in your junior at a top college, right? You can pick the 10 colleges where 90% of the guys are coming from, men and women. You do an analyst program, you go over to a private equity firm for a couple of years, you go into an MBA, you get recruited back out, you have a path toward making a partner. But at some point for every professional, you have to choose your own path, right? And that can happen at the end of 25 years in the industry where you say, okay, am I going to start my own thing? Or it can happen like it did for you at the very beginning. And I think for folks who are happening at the beginning, how you approach risk and return as it comes to these new ventures it's quite different permanently. So, talk about how you set out to launch BroadPeak at this stage of your career after having been at Invesco for such a number of years. But how do you approach risk return in these type of business decisions, having had the career you've had? And how do you see this different from the colleagues you might have who are still at an large organization, from one organization to another organization, and are highly nervous even 25 years into their career about whether they could do something?
Oh, absolutely. That's a terrific question, and I'll bifurcate it into two parts. And the first part being, advice I always give, junior folks or people earlier in their careers when asked of me. One piece of advice I like to give is to often take a step back and think about where you want to be 5 years from now and where you want to be 15 years from now. And it's not always the same answer, but one will tend to lead to the other. And if the current position really does not, does not facilitate both that 5-year and 15-year vision, then one needs to, I think, assess whether or not a course correction is needed. And so that's something I've consistently done throughout my career, and just advice I like to give people, because often you get a little bit stuck looking at things too closely. Right, the day-to-day is hectic, chaotic, busy, and so it's not often easy to separate the forest from the trees. But sometimes you have to, right, in terms of just the long-term mapping and trajectory of what one's career is looking like, and what goals one ultimately wants to achieve. And so, the second part of your question of well, how does that lead to BroadPeak and doing this, relatively further on in my career, as I mentioned. W.L. Ross ultimately became a part of Invesco, and that transaction was a very good one. We operated well within that context for quite a number of years. Ultimately, so post the transaction, when we were sold to Invesco, Wilbur continued to run the platform. We ran more or less autonomously within Invesco, and he ultimately departed in very early 2017 to join the U.S. government administration down in Washington, and I took over as head of the group. And so from 2017 forward, I led the group. And one thing that struck me in looking back at things was, the industry just has continued to become, faster, more competitive, sharper. And remembering, sort of leaning on the experience of the earlier days of when W.L. Ross was formed, where we were able to be just a bit more nimble, a bit more entrepreneurial, at least for myself and certain members of my team. We had a desire to get back to that ability to operate in that fashion. And so, I think putting some wind in our sails, we happened to then have a pandemic kind of come and disrupt everything. And so, as we as a group talked about what our plans would be, it just seemed like the proper time. And Invesco itself had grown to be several times the size it was when we initially became part of it in 2006. And so, we were sort of a very small piece of a very significantly sized enterprise. And for us, we felt to be effective, we needed to be a bit more of a focal point. And so we started the dialogue with Invesco, and they fully saw it as a non-core part of the business as well. And so we were able to come to a very amicable way to set up BroadPeak as a separate independent enterprise. We still have certain ties back to Invesco. We still work with a number of the teams back there. But in terms of new business activity and what our business plans are going forward, it is an independent enterprise. And so we've already started to do a number of things, a bit differently, which we think, blends well to the vision we have and what we want to do within the space.
I imagine being a distressed investor, having a restructuring background, you approach a crisis like a pandemic very differently as well, having started with the Asian financial crisis, spinning out a year before the tech bubble burst, getting acquired, merging in with Invesco a year or two before the financial crisis really set in. So these things aren't, quite disfamiliar to you. How has just what you do on a day-to-day perspective, as far as restructuring distress, led you to approach these displacements for how you run your own business?
No, for sure. So as I was saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so I guess you can say, in a way, we practiced what we preached, right? And so, we sort of officially became fully independent in September of 2020, and that's when we formalized sort of the legal separation of the group from the Invesco corporate structure. And so, it did, in a ways, help facilitate it, because there was already dislocation going on in the marketplace, that we felt that it was the proper time to try to execute on it. And it really has allowed us to, operate in a means that is, everyone's operating in a way that's somewhat different than they have historically. And so, the fact that our day-to-day activities don't look like they did 18 months ago, well, that's true for everyone. and everyone generally, and everyone specifically in private equity and investing. And so,
talking about doing business differently, how many podcasts have you ever done?
This is my first. I'm rather enjoying it, because you do get mulligans. I'm used to speaking at conferences and things like that, and so no takebacks and do-overs in those, and so and I suppose I'm sort of aging myself by saying I'm not actually terribly familiar with the entire podcast universe and ecosystem, and so.
But this is the beauty of being an entrepreneur, right? Even at this stage of your career, you're learning and doing new things.
Well, one of the best sayings I heard recently, and so I didn't come up with it, but I think it's a brilliant assessment of where we are, and which is the pace of change in the world has never been this fast, but it will never be this slow again. And I think that's indicative of just how I think about the world, again, just generally, but also investing specifically. And so, one thing that we set up in terms of our business that reflects that is we've got two primary activities today. One, which I call our more traditional PE, as you mentioned. I do have a distressed background, and I'd say, broadly speaking, the strategy and the mentality of the team is one of a more value orientation, and so you can think about more traditional type industries and situations. At the same time, a number of months ago, we launched and closed on a SPAC in the marketplace, and the focal point of the SPAC is really the cross section between traditional industry and new technology and innovation. And so when you think about pace of change going on today, I proffer that every single industry that's out there is undergoing some form of disruption and dislocation that's being technology driven. And some more than others, right? Obviously, looking backwards, retail has undergone just an enormous transformation. Looking at where we are today, right? FinTech is gaining a ton of traction, but you can go on and on and on. Automotive is going to look, vastly different 5 to 10 years from now than what it's looked like, since 1908 when the first car, or at least the first mass-produced car was made. And so you can go down the line of every industry, and there's quite a bit going on in terms of changes. And so we put these two vehicles together because we think it gives us a good synergy and good perspective on sort of what are the problems. So when you're inside a traditional business today, and we sit on a number of the boards that we're invested in, and we talk about at that level with executives and other board members, what are the challenges coming up? What do we see coming down the road that we're going to have to deal with, and how do we set strategy around that? And so you could think about that as the traditional private equity perspective, and then from our SPAC perspective, we're seeing what are these new enabling technologies that are out there, right? That are meant to either solve these problems or to help drive these businesses forward, into a new way of doing business. And so, having both of those perspectives has really been helpful for us as an organization, in both, figuring out, of these new technologies, what is useful, right? What is a problem solving innovation that's out there that's worth looking at potentially putting capital behind, and from the more traditional seat within within some of these corporate boardrooms, what do we need to be aware of? What's going to be a disruptor? What's going to be an enabler? How do we position ourselves? How do we make sure that we either are ahead of the curve, with the curve, but just making sure that we don't find ourselves, behind in either what we know of, what we're doing, and so putting those two pieces together in today's market environment, we have found to be very useful.
Your personal experience of having been in a smaller team, independent, when you launched W.L. Ross, to being part of larger organizations within Rothschild and later Invesco, there's obviously pros and cons to both environments. You're launching a firm now at this stage that's also knowing that the world is going to be different post-pandemic. What are the opportunities for you to create an asset management business that's going to be next gen that you see maybe legacy business, whether small or large, are going to struggle to compete with you on?
One of the big ones is really just the technology overlay that's going to, I think, be in part a permanent part of the business now. And what I mean by that is pre-pandemic, I was on the road easily 50% of my days, right? You can't find opportunities. I used to say you can't find new opportunities sitting behind your desk. That saying is becoming obsolete. And so it doesn't mean that you're never going to leave your office again, but I think the percentage of one's time that will be spent sitting on airplanes, going off to distant destinations for just one meeting or a small number of meetings. I think people have figured out that there's just a much more efficient way to do that now. And so if we look at just from our own beginnings, and since we started BroadPeak and where we are today, we've been able to raise a significant amount of capital without having a single in-person meeting. Now, pre-March of 2020, I would have told you that is simply not possible. But where we stand today, it's not only possible, we've done it. And so, will that be the permanent way that things work? Short answer is no, right? I am very much looking forward to, being in a room and being able to shake the hands of our partners who have, bestowed and trusted new capital with us. But that being said, there are ways for which I think traditional activities in our business, how it was done pre-pandemic, and how we figured out how to rework those activities such that it can be done more efficiently, is going to stay. There is a personal element here that will come back, and I think is necessary to come back. Just like, I do think that, the idea sharing of being physically in an office together and spitballing thoughts and sitting around a conference room table to either problem solve or whiteboard or whatnot. I don't think you can replace that, through Zoom or whatever medium people use. But I do think there's going to be a hybrid model such that, that things will not go 100% back to the way it worked before.
And getting back to your view towards a 15-year goal, what is BroadPeak 15 years from now? What are you 15 years from now, if they're not the same thing?
15 years from now, I hope to be, I hope to continue to be extremely active in the space. Investing is something you do. I think to spend any meaningful period of time in it, you do have to have, a passion for it, because, it is something that tends to be, somewhat intrusive in other parts of your life, and so, for me, thankfully, it's what I do, right? It's what I like to think about the moment I wake up, and it's what I think about as I'm headed off to sleep, and so. But 15 years from now, look, what we'd like to do is build a model that provides for, flexibility that allows us to find attractive investment opportunities, regardless as to, what cycles that we're in, that allow us to identify and deploy capital into just high quality businesses, that we can then, find means to add some form of value to, under our reign of ownership. And so, and as we think about that, that means having flexibility in the type of capital that you have, the types of situations that you can go into. As an example, I've always thought being able to move up and down a capital structure was very important when one's investing, right? So some, the very same situation can make a terrible equity investment, but a brilliant debt investment, and vice versa. And so, we always keep that in mind. I already mentioned having geographic flexibility. I think having, I do think from a sector standpoint, it's very difficult to be at the end of the day, an absolute generalist anymore. That has changed quite a bit. So I think having domain expertise around what you do is important. And so that's not to say that we intend to specialize in just one sector, but we do have, I'd say, a small, fairly narrow set of sectors that that we feel we have very good backgrounds around. And so, in 15 years, I think what we'd like to do is build those ingredients, into a platform that's able to really be effective, investing in different types of situations.
You joined Wilbur as an analyst and continue to work with him for 20 years. The nature of junior professionals today, you don't anticipate that type of thing happening as often as it might have once upon a time. So when you think about building your team, how do you think about it now? Obviously, you're building it at a time where you have a partner like a Trust Vista, but what is the makeup of the junior people, and how do you see them fitting into your 15-year plan?
Yeah, sure. I agree with you. The market is somewhat different today than as I was coming through, but not so much. Even back in the late 90s, it was sort of sort of common knowledge, right? The best way to get a raise is simply to move shops, and so it's not that wasn't an element within the business. But I think, people have thought about it maybe a little bit longer term back then of, hey, is the immediate bump necessarily the best thing? And obviously something I always, thought about along the way. And so I do think the world just in that regard is faster, right? The velocity of how younger people think about their life, their careers, what they want to do. All of that has sped up. And so, I think longer term, as we think about our platform and our enterprise, number one, reputation is important, right? Having a reputation in the marketplace of being a group that does smart things, that treat people the right way, um, where you can learn, where you can build. I think all of that are important elements in being able to attract and retain talent. I do think that one needs to recognize that it is, less commonplace now for someone to spend sort of decades on end um, in one spot. But so it makes it even more critical that one's ability, right, a platform's ability to attract new talent, new people, to be a destination that people want to come and work and see it, right? If ultimately it is going to be a transient place within one's career, make sure that it is accretive to their career, right? That they'll build their knowledge base, that they'll see, creative and smart things going on that they can learn and put into, right, and put into their own playbook as they build their skill set. And so that's something we're very mindful of in terms of, just not just the activities that we do, but how we also bring, junior people along. And so I've always been a big fan of doing, different workshops. We bring in often, our third party providers just to do, sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's a half day, but just talk about, whether it's our favorite lawyers, our favorite, financial forensics firms, our favorite financial engineering people. Just bring in, who we think are the high caliber advisors that we use and have them talk about, hey, here's what we do, here's how we figured certain things out. And that's invaluable for people looking to build their own skill set, their own toolboxes. Hopefully, for many years with us, but as we've recognized, the marketplace, does have more velocity and people moving around, and so we just want to make sure that we're a stop that people want to make along the lines.
Related in parallel to the junior teams that you have, obviously outsourcing isn't a thing that was there 20 years ago, not certainly in the way it is now, and it's a growing trend for PE firms to outsource work streams, ranging from diligence to research to sourcing and even exit related activities. What are the benefits of outsourcing work streams for PE funds generally, and more importantly for an emerging manager?
Sure, I'd say it's several fold, and as you know, as a part of setting up our outsource program initially when we were part of Invesco, and we've carried that over now to BroadPeak, and if we look at the challenges within the industry, it really helps in several ways. So number one, high quality junior talent has for a number of years now been in high demand, and so. Everyone's heard about sort of, when that season opens up out of the investment banks and it's an absolute food fight, to then, get whatever the top of the class is, signed up from there. And so, it's been an issue sort of across the industry for a while now. And then you compound that with the fact that you then spend X period of time sort of training, getting them to work within the ways that your organization does things, and it feels like by the time you can put things into, I won't say autopilot, but at least the training portion subsides and perhaps the more steady state happens. that's almost the natural time for them to move on to the next destination. And so that's a cycle that, from a management perspective, is just a challenge to work through. And so the ability to outsource and have a bit more stability there at a level which is absolutely critical for all organizations, large and small, to be able to leverage, because that there's always there's never a shortage of things for sort of the analyst and associate level of people to do, and so just having that to complement one's internal resources, and just having that to buffer a little bit that cycle that requires a lot of hands-on management to deal with. I find very helpful for managing an organization, and I say for the industry, it provides a little bit of a stable buffer that I think more and more people are sort of bringing into the mix.
Talking about teams, I was having a conversation earlier today with one of my AVPs who started with us as an analyst, and talking about how his career has evolved and how his role at every level has been different, and how the roles above and ahead of him continue to be different. And often individuals don't have an appreciation for the challenges, the different layers face and feel. When you start WL Ross, there's Wilbur Ross, who has a very clear role in the team as kind of the head of the organization. At BroadPeak, you have a co-founding partner, as I have a co-founding partner at Trust Vista as well. And that's a very unique relationship as well when you have an organization with two co-founding partners. What is the value of having a co-founding partner, as you've seen it, compared to the organizations you've been a part of, where there's always a single person who might have been at the top of the pyramid?
Yeah, sure. And so Nadeem Qureshi is my partner, co-founder of BroadPeak. We had worked together very closely since 2015. We had helped set up a presence in Asia for our activities from 2016 through 2020, and did it from the ground up. And so again, we sort of put our own boots on the ground there, and built up a pretty significant sort of network infrastructure, set of relationships, and had deployed a pretty good amount of capital in the region. And then back in almost about 2018, he actually moved out to China to help manage what we had put on the ground there. And so what helped us, and as we were thinking about doing this, was one, we had spent quite a number of years working very closely together, and enjoyed sort of what we were doing, and built up, on a, I guess, more micro, at least geographic scale, a new business. And then two, what helps for us is we have very different backgrounds. So he comes out of both the private sector as an executive within industry, as well as being a consultant. And so it really helps to complement things as we look at, we look at the same thing from slightly different angles. And so we have found that has proven to be quite useful in many circumstances.
Actually, the name of our company, Trust Vista, is a play on many views, because we had co-founding partners all who have a very different perspective, but that was what we always thought was one of our strengths, was right? Is not getting a bunch of people who are going to always agree with each other, but people who will challenge each other and look at things from different perspectives. That creates a lot of value in a partnership and in a team broadly.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And to me, I've always thought of private equity as a team sport, and that's why investment committees are important, right? There are different ways. To let's say, invest behind a singular view, if that's what you wanted to do, versus private equity, which like you have deal teams, you have investment committees, you tend to bring in many different points of view in order to drive your decision making. And so it's a big part of sort of our philosophy in how this business works and what makes it successful.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time today. It's been a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your story and journey. We're very excited to be partners with you and talk to you in 5 and 15 years.
Terrific. Well, I look forward to it. I look forward to the next one. Sorry. I very much look forward to the next one.